Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tackling a massive, incredibly misunderstood topic, the true centuries-long history behind the economic state of the African continent. We hear a ton of generalizations today, but we're going to dig into the historical architecture of how this economic landscape was actually built. Whenever you ask the question, why is Africa really poor? You usually get some pretty vague answers, right? People are quick to point to corruption, or history of colonization, or foreign interference. But, those are really just symptoms. We rarely dig into the root causes. Why do these vulnerabilities even exist in the first place? Well, to really understand this, we need to completely hit refresh on our perspective. The whole myth of inherent poverty completely shatters when you contrast our modern assumptions with the reality of the 14th century. It's a wildly different picture. Back then, West Africa was actually home to Mansa Musa, literally the wealthiest person in human history. The continent was just as technologically and diplomatically connected to the world as Europe or Asia. So what exactly happened to all that wealth? To understand the systematic dismantling of this prosperity, we're going to journey through 5 distinct historical eras: the myth of poverty, the engines of stagnation, the colonial extraction machine, the independence paradox, and finally, the African Renaissance. All right, let's jump straight into section 1, the myth of poverty and the reality of ancient wealth. There is this incredibly persistent stereotype that before colonization, Africa didn't really have an established history or developed civilizations, but the reality, pre-colonial Africa was deeply plugged into global trade routes. Across the continent, societies had mastered advanced metallurgy that was absolutely on par with Europe. They developed complex mathematical theories, and they governed through these amazingly intricate systems of city-states, kingdoms, and massive empires. They were absolutely thriving. Moving right along to section 2, the engines of stagnation and the very real human cost of global trade. This timeline perfectly maps out what is essentially the ultimate brain drain. Back in the 15th century, European empires realized they desperately needed labor for their brand new American colonies, especially after diseases wiped out native populations. And this triggered a devastating shift from the 16th to the 18th centuries, the capturing and selling of highly skilled African craftspeople, literally the exact people who would have driven technological progress, directly coincided with the rapid industrialization of Europe and Asia. So while the rest of the world was innovating and building local industries, Africa's industries just stagnated, all because their most productive minds were being forcibly removed. So here's the absolutely crucial point. African leaders were caught in a brutal survival trap. With neighboring kingdoms turning to warfare to capture slaves for European traders, any given leader had to protect their own people. And to do that, they had to invest heavily in militaries, not local industries. And how on earth do they pay for the imported European weapons they needed to survive? With human lives. It was this vicious, inescapable cycle that completely drained the continent's economic potential for centuries. Which brings us to section 3, the colonial extraction machine and the infamous Scramble for Africa. Now listen to this quote. "Although I can call Paris from my office telephone here in Lomé, I cannot place a call to Lagos in Nigeria, only 250 miles away." That was said by the first president of Togo, and it perfectly captures the sheer absurdity of what European colonizers built. The infrastructure wasn't designed for the people actually living there, it was designed for the empires pulling the strings thousands of miles away. European powers didn't build infrastructure to connect local trade centers. No, they built a giant extraction machine. The roads, the railroads, they were designed purely to move raw materials from the rich interiors straight to the coast to be shipped off. Communication networks totally bypassed neighbors, forcing a phone call to literally travel thousands of miles to Paris rather than just 250 miles next door to Lagos. The wealth of the continent was being systematically siphoned outward. Let's dive into section 4, the independence paradox and the inheritance of a vacuum. Just let this single number sink in for a second. 8,000. Out of roughly 200 million Black Africans in the 1950s, only about 8,000 had been allowed to receive a secondary education under colonial rule. Can you even imagine trying to build an entire modern nation, a medical system, an educational system, a functioning economy, when you have been systematically denied the basic training and education required to do so? It was the inheritance of a complete vacuum of skills. And compounding this massive lack of skills, these new leaders faced just devastating odds trying to keep their newly independent nations afloat. They were battling incredibly harsh geography, dealing with massive multi-year droughts. They were fighting completely preventable diseases like malaria or river blindness where literal worms live in the eyes, which absolutely drained the workforce. And on top of all of that, they were caught smack in the middle of the Cold War geopolitical trap, basically forced to choose sides between global superpowers just to get basic aid. Because of this impossible inheritance, leaders understandably turned to a concept called African socialism. The theory here was to force rapid industrialization through central government control. But in reality, this central planning completely fell apart. Why? Well, because they completely lacked an educated entrepreneurial class to actually run these businesses. And this failure, combined with a lack of institutional oversight, led to a really brutal cycle. Foreign companies looking for cheap oil and minerals, which is bribe government officials for access. The elites got richer, the people stayed poor, and this instability led to an astonishing 40 successful military coups in just the first 2 decades of independence. Finally, we arrive at Section 5, the African Renaissance and dismantling the architecture. Okay, so I know that's a heavy history. Absolutely. But the narrative shifts dramatically as we enter the 1990s. Modern African leaders and citizens are actively combating these historical hurdles by redefining the future on their own terms. We're seeing democratizing governments bringing much-needed stability. Through institutions like the African Union, they're reducing internal trade barriers to finally connect those historically isolated markets and empower local economies. And most importantly, they are fostering an incredibly vibrant environment for homegrown, distinctly African innovation. We are seeing some truly amazing African-led solutions emerging today that tackle very specific local challenges. For instance, over at Lake Victoria, local scientists took a massive environmental problem, an invasive hyacinth plant that was literally choking the waters, and successfully transformed it into a lucrative, protein-rich animal feed that is now exported and sold globally. It is a totally brilliant example of turning a local obstacle into a global economic advantage. And you know what? These advantages are really stacking up. By strategically leveraging shared time zones with Europe, modern tech hubs are popping up all over the continent. But even more importantly, we are witnessing the rise of a highly educated new generation, the most skilled generation in Africa's entire history. Because of this, a fast-growing middle class is finally taking shape. That means Africans are increasingly producing goods for African markets, keeping wealth circulating within the continent rather than being extracted. The overarching poverty we see today wasn't some random accident. It was an architecture systematically engineered over centuries of extraction and disruption. But as this architecture is finally being dismantled by a new, highly educated and empowered generation, we're left with a massive, incredibly exciting question to ponder. What will the world look like when the African Renaissance is fully realized? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the headlines.